My name is Daniel Hayes, and at 21 I thought I had everything figured out. I was halfway through my English degree, clinging to the belief that if I worked hard enough, I'd mold myself into the kind of writer people admired. But my essays always fell short, my sentences tangled themselves, and the more I tried to fix them, the worse they became. That was the first problem. The second problem was Professor James Carter. He wasn't just another faculty member. He was the one everyone on campus talked about, sharp-minded, unshakably composed, and, in a way that no one dared to admit out loud, magnetic. His reputation was built on precision. Every lecture was seamless, every paper he returned came with surgical notes in the margins. He was the kind of man who seemed immune to distraction, straight-laced, untouchable, and yet, for reasons I didn't quite understand, I was the student he asked to stay after class. At first, it was practical. My essays needed work, and he wanted to help me cut through my muddled thoughts. But that evening, the first time the classroom door clicked shut behind the last student, I felt the shift. The sound of the lock startled me. It was casual, almost routine, but in the silence that followed, it echoed like a verdict. We were alone, sealed off from the world. "Sit," he said, motioning toward the front row. His tone was calm, measured, but there was a tension underneath it I hadn't noticed before. I obeyed, clutching my notebook. He took off his jacket, draping it neatly over the chair, and rolled his sleeves just enough to reveal strong wrists. It was a small gesture, but I noticed it, the way skin replaced fabric, the way formality gave way to something less guarded. He leaned over my desk, scanning my essay with those quick, exacting eyes. "Your argument begins here," he said, tapping the paper, "but you bury it under unnecessary flourishes. You're chasing beauty at the expense of clarity." His voice was low, steady. But his proximity unsettled me. His tie brushed the edge of my notebook, and I caught the faint scent of his cologne, something clean, understated, like cedar after rain. I tried to focus on his words, but my pulse betrayed me, quickening with every second he lingered close. When his sleeve brushed against my wrist, I froze. It was nothing, an accident, a graze of fabric, but it felt like more. I glanced up, half expecting him to recoil, but instead he paused too. Just for a heartbeat. Then he pulled back, clearing his throat as though resetting the boundaries. "You're capable of sharper thinking, Daniel. You just need discipline." His eyes lingered on mine as he said it, and in that moment I wondered if he meant something else entirely. I nodded quickly, looking down at the red ink scrawled across my paper. "I'll do better," I whispered, though I wasn't sure whether I was promising him or myself. We worked in silence after that, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but crowded, with thoughts, with questions, with a charge I didn't dare put into words. When the clock struck 7, he gathered his note. I assumed he'd dismiss me, but instead, he sat back on the desk, studying me with a look I couldn't decode. "You have potential," he said quietly. Not the polished encouragement he gave in lecture, but something stripped down, almost personal. It was then I realized the central conflict, the one that would undo me. James Carter wasn't just my professor. He was a man who looked at me differently when the door was locked. And I couldn't decide which terrified me more, that I was imagining it or that I wasn't. I packed my things slowly, hoping he'd say something more, something to confirm the invisible thread pulling between us. He didn't. He only smiled, a small, rare curve of his lips, and said, "See you next week." But that smile followed me out of the building, burned into my mind. It wasn't the smile of a professor encouraging a student. It was softer, quieter. The kind of smile that hinted at secrets. I walked into the night with my chest tight, the echo of the lock still in my ears. Whatever it was between us, it had begun. The following week, I told myself I wouldn't linger after class. I packed up quickly, avoided Carter's gaze, and aimed for the door like every other student. But then he said my name. "Daniel. Stay a moment." Just like that, the decision wasn't mine anymore. The classroom emptied, chairs scraping against the floor, voices fading down the hall until the only sound left was the steady tick of the wall clock. And then, inevitably, the click of the lock. He didn't explain it this time. No mention of avoiding interruptions, no pretense. Just the decisive turn of the key. My pulse betrayed me instantly, hammering in my ears. "Sit," he said again, gesturing toward the front row. His tone was calm, but his eyes held a weight that hadn't been there before. I sat, notebook open, pen ready, pretending this was about essays, when we both knew it wasn't only that. He removed his jacket, rolled his sleeves. His tie was slightly loosened, and I found myself staring at the line of his throat, the exposed skin just above his collar. I forced my eyes down to the paper, but concentration was impossible. He leaned over me, scanning my work. His hand rested on the desk, inches from mine. I could feel the heat radiating off him. "You've improved," he murmured. His voice was lower than usual, softer. I swallowed. "Trying to." "You don't need to try so hard," he said, eyes flicking to mine before returning to the page. Sometimes the simplest words carry the most weight. For a moment, it felt like he wasn't talking about essays at all. His knuckles brushed mine as he shifted the paper. It was nothing. It was everything. A small, fleeting contact that sent a rush of heat through me. I didn't pull away, not immediately. And in that brief pause, in the fraction of a second we lingered too close, I caught his breath hitch. Then he straightened abruptly, retreating to the safety of his desk. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat. "Focus on clarity. Don't bury the point." I nodded, pretending my chest wasn't tightening, pretending my thoughts weren't racing in circles. But the air had changed. Later, as I gathered my things, my pen rolled off the desk and slipped beneath his. We both crouched at the same time, reaching. Suddenly, we were face to face in the narrow space beneath the desk. His glasses nearly brushed my temple. His hand hovered inches from mine. I could see the flecks of green in his otherwise brown eyes, the faint crease at the corner as if he were holding back words. For a suspended heartbeat, neither of us moved. Too close. Too dangerous. I jerked back first, bumping my head against the underside of the desk. He let out a startled laugh, short, nervous, the kind that betrayed the tension we were both fighting. I laughed too, rubbing my head, though it wasn't funny. It was unbearable. When I stood, he was still watching me. Not as a professor, not as a mentor. As something else. Something unspoken. "You should be more careful," he said finally. His voice was steady, but his eyes told another story. I nodded, clutching my folder like a shield. "Yeah." We didn't speak after that. Not as I zipped my bag, not as he stacked his papers. But the silence between us was louder than words, filled with everything we weren't admitting. As I left, I glanced back. He was standing by the desk, jacket in hand, staring at the locked door as though it held the answer to a question neither of us dared ask. Outside, the night air was cool, sharp against my skin. But all I could feel was the nearness of him, the accidental touch that wasn't accidental, the silence that had become too charged to ignore. I knew then, this wasn't in my head. It wasn't nothing. And yet, it couldn't be something. Not with him. Not with the rules, the risks, the lines we weren't supposed to cross. But lines blurred when doors locked. And every time I heard that click, I knew we were both stepping closer to something neither of us was ready to name. That thought followed me all the way home, clinging tighter than my own shadow. Too close to be nothing. And far too late to pretend otherwise. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that what happened meant nothing. Professors brushed hands with students all the time, didn't they? People leaned too close, shared a laugh, got caught in awkward silences. It was ordinary. But I knew better. The problem wasn't the moment. The problem was the silence afterward, heavy, deliberate, full of everything he hadn't said. When Thursday evening arrived, I walked into his seminar with the same nervous resolve I'd been building all week. I wouldn't stay behind. I wouldn't give him another chance to close the door. I'd hand in my essay, take my notes, and leave like everyone else. But as the class ended and students shuffled out, Professor Carter glanced up. Just once. Just long enough. "Daniel," he said, smooth and steady as ever. "Stay a moment." My heart betrayed me before I could think. I stayed. The last chair scraped against the floor. The final voice trailed down the corridor. And then, the lock. That sharp, decisive click that now felt less like habit and more like confession. This time, he didn't begin with my paper. He didn't move toward the desk. Instead, he sat on the edge of his own, jacket off, tie loosened, sleeves rolled to the elbows. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked less like a professor and more like a man. "You ever feel," he asked quietly, "like you're carrying more than you should?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't about syntax or clarity. It was about weight, the kind you hide in plain sight. I hesitated, then nodded. "All the time." He looked down at his hands, clasped loosely in his lap, then back up at me. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. I'm not sure anyone really knows how heavy it is until they admit it out loud. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. The silence swelled between us again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was raw. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. "I shouldn't say things like that to you." The admission hit me harder than the words themselves. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, like he wanted me to know, and yet wished he hadn't let it slip. "You're allowed to be human," I whispered before I could stop myself. His eyes flicked to mine, and for the briefest moment, he looked startled. As if no one had ever said that to him. We sat like that, two men on opposite sides of a locked classroom, the silence alive with unspoken truths. Finally, he stood, pacing once before stopping in front of me. "You're a good student, Daniel. You should focus on that." But the way he said it, strained, careful, as though warning himself more than me, told me the truth. This wasn't about essays anymore. I packed my things slowly, waiting for him to add something, to break the tension. He didn't. His restraint was ironclad. But when I brushed past him toward the door, I felt it again. His eyes on me, following me, holding me in place. I stopped with my hand on the knob. "It doesn't feel like nothing," I said before I could think better of it. The words hung in the air, bold and irreversible. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, still, his jaw tight, his breath caught somewhere between denial and confession. Then, quietly, firmly, he said, "Go home, Daniel." I did. But my chest burned the whole way back to my apartment. Because I knew now, without question, silence wasn't avoidance. Silence was acknowledgement. And if silence could say that much, what would happen the day one of us finally spoke the truth? I didn't know what to expect when I walked into Carter's class the following week. Part of me thought he would avoid me, that he'd keep his distance after what I'd said. It doesn't feel like nothing. Maybe he'd decide it was too risky to let me stay behind, too dangerous to give silence another chance to speak for him. But when the last student filed out and the door clicked shut, he didn't say a word. He simply turned the key in the lock, as always, and the air grew heavy again. I stayed rooted in my seat, heart racing. He gathered his papers with deliberate calm, but his hands weren't steady. His thumb tapped the edge of the folder, an unconscious stutter in his movements. Finally, he set the papers down and looked at me. "You've been writing better," he said. His voice was measured, but it wavered at the edges. "Trying to keep things clear," I murmured. He nodded. "Clarity matters." His eyes lingered on mine. "In writing. In other things too." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. I wanted to ask him what he meant. I wanted to demand it. But instead, he crossed the room and stood beside my desk. He didn't lean over my paper this time. He didn't correct anything. He just stood there, close enough for me to feel the tension radiating from him. "Daniel," he began, but then stopped. His hand came down, Not on the desk, not on the paper, but on my shoulder. It wasn't a firm grip. Just a gentle weight, warm through the fabric of my shirt. But it stayed. I looked up at him, and the world tilted. His expression wasn't the polished mask he wore in lecture. It was unguarded, conflicted, raw. "Professor," I started, my voice unsteady. "James," he corrected, his tone barely above a whisper. The name slipped into me like a secret. His hand tightened slightly on my shoulder, and I should have pulled away. We both should have. But neither of us moved. My pulse thudded under his palm, my breath shallow, and still, he didn't let go. When his thumb brushed, just barely, against the side of my neck, a shiver shot through me. It was nothing. It was everything. He exhaled, shaky, and then, too quickly, he pulled back. The warmth of his touch vanished, leaving a ghost of heat on my skin. "This," he said, turning away, running a hand through his hair as if trying to reset himself. "This can't happen." I swallowed hard. But it already did. He froze at that, his back to me. His shoulders stiffened, his silence louder than anything he could have said. I gathered my notebook slowly, not wanting the moment to end, not wanting to break the fragile thread that connected us. But he still wouldn't turn around. When I reached the door, I paused. My voice came out quieter than I intended. "It doesn't feel like nothing to you either." For a long moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, barely audible, I heard him say, "That's the problem." I left the room with my chest burning, every nerve alive. His touch had been fleeting, but it stayed with me, branded into my skin, replaying in my mind, impossible to shake. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't imagination. It was real. And now, no matter how much he tried to retreat, we both knew it. I avoided him for 3 days. Not because I wanted to, but because every time I thought about the way his hand lingered on my shoulder, the way his thumb brushed my neck like it wasn't supposed to but did anyway, my chest tightened. I didn't know what terrified me more, the possibility that he regretted it or the possibility that he didn't. By the time Thursday came, I knew I couldn't stay away. I sat through his lecture pretending to take notes, though I couldn't hear half the words he said. His eyes skimmed the class, never landing on me for more than a fraction of a second. It was enough to tell me he was trying to bury what had happened, but failing. When the last student left, I stayed. He didn't ask this time. He just looked at me like he'd known all along I wouldn't leave. The silence stretched. He didn't move to the door, didn't reach for the lock, but the tension was the same. Finally I spoke. My voice came out low, unsteady. "Why do you keep doing this?" His jaw tightened. "Doing what?" "Looking at me like that. Locking the door. Touching me." My words hung sharp between us. "Pretending it's nothing." He drew in a long breath, steadying himself, but when he spoke his voice was softer than I expected. "Because if I don't pretend, Daniel, I don't know what happens next." The honesty in it nearly undid me. I stepped closer, not enough to touch but enough to feel the heat from his body. "Maybe you don't have to pretend." His eyes flicked to mine, then away. "You don't understand the risk." "Then explain it to me," I pressed. "Because it doesn't feel like nothing. And I can't keep walking away like it is." The room was unbearably quiet, except for the uneven rhythm of our breathing. He ran a hand across his face, exhaling slowly, as if the weight of years pressed against his ribs. "You're my student," he said finally. The words were firm, but his tone betrayed him. "It isn't supposed to cross that line." I swallowed hard. "Then why did you let it?" That silenced him. He stared at me, eyes searching mine, as if hoping I'd offer him an escape. But I didn't. I stood there, every nerve alive, every part of me demanding the truth. At last, he whispered, "Because when I'm in this room with you, I forget the rules." The admission cracked something open between us. I felt it, sharp and undeniable, like air rushing into a locked chamber. I moved before I could stop myself, closing the last inch of space between us, not touching, just breathing the same air. My voice was almost a whisper. So what if it's real? He froze, his eyes dropping to my lips before flicking back up. His breath hitched, but he didn't move away. His restraint was trembling, fragile, ready to snap. I don't know if I can give you what you want, he said. His words caught somewhere between fear and longing. I'm not asking for anything, I told him. I just don't want to pretend anymore. For a moment, the silence was unbearable. Then, slowly, carefully, he lifted his hand, the same hand that had once rested on my shoulder, and let it hover near my cheek. His fingers trembled, as though even the possibility of touch carried the weight of consequence. When they finally brushed my skin, just the faintest graze, it was electric. Not a kiss. Not an embrace. Just the simple truth of contact. We both exhaled at the same time, like we'd been holding our breath for weeks. And then he pulled back, too quickly, his hand falling away like the moment had burned him. This isn't fair to you, he said, voice tight. Maybe it's not about fair, I whispered. He closed his eyes, steadying himself, before finally stepping back. Go home, Daniel. I hesitated, my chest aching, but I obeyed. As I left the classroom, I realized something had changed. We hadn't named it, hadn't dared to. But the silence wasn't silence anymore. It was confession. And the truth was out, whether either of us was ready for it or not. The weekend stretched like a wound that wouldn't close. I told myself I'd stay away, give him the space he clearly thought we needed. But on Sunday night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized I was counting hours until I could see him again. By Monday, my body moved faster than my brain. I lingered after class, though I'd promised myself I wouldn't. He noticed, of course. His eyes hardened in that way that meant he was holding back a storm. Daniel, he said, when the room was empty. His voice was tight, formal. You can't keep staying behind. I swallowed, feeling my chest tighten. Why not? Because it's dangerous. Dangerous for who? I asked. For both of us, he snapped, then softened, like he regretted letting it slip. His hand ran over his mouth, covering the crack in his composure. Don't make me spell it out. But I wanted him to. I wanted him to say it, to stop speaking in half-truths and broken silences. You already did, I said, stepping closer. Last week. You said when you're with me, you forget the rules. That silenced him. His jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed him. Dark, alive, burning with something he couldn't control. I reached for the desk between us, setting my palm flat on its wood. Slowly, deliberately, he mirrored me, placing his hand close to mine, but not touching. The gap was small enough to hum like static. Do you regret it? I asked quietly. He inhaled sharply, eyes locked on our hands. Every day. Then, softer, and not for a second. The contradiction broke something inside me. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to drag him across the line he'd drawn so carefully. Instead, I let the silence sharpen. Finally, I said, then stop pretending. Something in him gave way. I saw it in his shoulders, the way they slumped like he'd been carrying a secret so heavy it bent him. He moved around the desk, slow and deliberate, like a man walking into a crime he already knew he'd commit. When he stood in front of me, he didn't touch. He just looked at me, as if memorizing every detail before it vanished. His voice dropped low, trembling. Do you know what you're asking for? Yes, I breathed. I'm asking for honesty. His hand lifted, hesitating midair, before cupping the side of my face. The warmth of it undid me. My eyes fluttered shut, but I didn't move, didn't close the distance. I let him decide. Daniel, his voice cracked, my name breaking in his throat. If I start, I don't know if I can stop. Then don't. That shattered his restraint. His mouth found mine, not in a rush but in a surrender. Slow, deliberate, like he'd been starving but wanted to savor every second. The kiss was cautious, careful, but underneath it pulsed a hunger that shook me to my core. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine. His breath was ragged. "This is wrong," he whispered. "Then why does it feel right?" I shot back, my voice raw. He didn't answer. He just closed his eyes, as if fighting himself all over again. I touched his chest, feeling the rapid pound of his heart. "Tell me to leave," I challenged. He opened his eyes, and for a long, fragile moment I thought he might. But he didn't. He pressed his lips together, shaking his head, and said instead, "I can't." That was all I needed. We stood there in the quiet, the air thick with everything we couldn't say aloud. The walls of the classroom seemed to hold our secret, pressing in, guarding it. For the first time, the silence wasn't terrifying. It was full, alive. When he finally stepped back, it wasn't rejection. It was mercy. "Go home," he murmured again, softer this time. "Before I make a choice I can't undo." I left with my chest on fire, my lips still tingling, my heart torn between guilt and wonder. Because whatever line we'd been pretending not to cross, we already had. And there was no going back. The kiss haunted me long after I left that classroom. I tasted it in the quiet of my room, felt it in the ache of my chest, replayed it every time I closed my eyes. What unsettled me most wasn't the act itself, it was how natural it had felt. Like we hadn't crossed a line but simply stepped into a truth that had been waiting all along. By Tuesday morning, my body betrayed me. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't stop glancing at the clock, measuring the hours until his lecture. When I walked into the hall, he was already there, standing straighter than usual, his face locked into that professional mask. For an entire hour, he didn't look at me. Not once. He might as well have been lecturing to ghosts. Every word was delivered to the blackboard, to his notes, to anywhere but me. And yet, I felt him. I felt the gravity of his presence like a current under the surface, dragging me in. When the class ended, he dismissed us briskly, his eyes still fixed on the desk. I almost left. Almost. But something in me refused to be erased. I lingered again. He noticed, of course he noticed, but this time he didn't bark an order. He just let out a long sigh, dropping the chalk, his shoulders slumping like a man already defeated. "Daniel," he said, his voice quieter than before, "why are you still here?" "Because you kissed me," I answered bluntly. "And I don't know how to pretend it didn't happen." His jaw tightened. I was weak. That's all it was. "No," I said, stepping closer. "That wasn't weakness. That was honesty." His eyes flicked up to mine then, sharp and conflicted, as if I'd cut too close to the bone. He pushed back from the desk, pacing, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand the stakes. If anyone finds out—" "No one will," I interrupted. "Unless you push me away." The words hung there, reckless, daring him to choose. For a long moment, he just stared at me. Then, without warning, he crossed the room in 3 strides and gripped my arm, pulling me closer than he ever had before. His voice was low, urgent. "Do you think I don't want this? Do you think I don't wake up at night with your face in my head, your voice in my ears?" The confession rocked me. I couldn't breathe. "Then stop fighting it," I whispered. His grip tightened before he released me, stepping back as if burned. He shook his head violently. "You don't know what you're asking me to risk. My career. My reputation. Everything I've built." I took a step forward, refusing to let him retreat. "And what about me? You think this is easy for me? Walking into this room every day, wanting something I'm told I can't have." Our eyes locked, the air between us sharp, heavy, dangerous. For the first time, I saw not just the professor but the man beneath, the man torn in two. Finally, he broke. His voice was almost a growl. "God help me, Daniel." He kissed me again. Harder this time. No hesitation, no restraint, just raw, desperate need. My back hit the wall, his hand braced beside my head, his body pinning me there. It was nothing like the careful tenderness of before. This was surrender, reckless and consuming. When he finally pulled back, both of us breathless, He kept his forehead pressed against mine. His whisper was ragged, guilty, hungry. This can't keep happening. Then stop, I challenged, my lips brushing his. But he didn't stop. He kissed me again. The dam had broken.